The morning the deed came back in her name, it was a Tuesday in late October of 2009, and the sky over the high desert was the color of old pewter, flat and low, and carrying the particular cold that comes off the plateau before the first hard freeze, a cold that doesn't apologize and doesn't warn you. It simply arrives and expects you to have been ready. She had not been ready for most of the things that had happened to her in the previous 4 years, but she was ready for this. She had the deed in a manila folder that she'd kept in the passenger seat of her truck for 11 days since the county recorder's office had stamped it, not because she needed to look at it constantly, but because she wasn't ready to put it away somewhere and let it become just a piece of paper, filed with other pieces of paper. It meant too much for that. It was a Tuesday, the 27th, 41 degrees at 9 in the morning, and the property was 90 acres of high desert scrubland in a drainage basin that other bidders at the tax sale had driven past without slowing down. She had slowed down. She had gotten out of the truck and walked 30 feet into the brush and stood there long enough to feel something she could not name precisely, only that it was the opposite of the hollow feeling she'd had for 4 years. And she got back in the truck and drove to the sale and bought the parcel for $4,600. That was the whole of it at first. $4,600 and a gut feeling in a stand of sage and 90 acres of ground that the county had been carrying on its books for 9 years without a single interested party. I want to tell you this story the way it deserves to be told, which means telling it slowly, because the slowness is the whole argument. The impatience is what the other side had, and they were wrong, and the proof of that wrongness took time to accumulate, and you need to sit with the accumulation the same way she did. Her name, for the purposes of this telling, is not important. What is important is what she was, which was a woman in her mid-40s who had spent 22 years raising fiber goats on rented ground in 2 different states and had never owned a single acre of her own, and what she knew, which was goats, and what she had inherited from her grandmother, which was a composition notebook with a marbled gray and black cover and a cracked spine, and 81 pages of handwriting in pencil that had gone the color of a dry creek bed, and what that notebook said on page 47, in a line that had been underlined twice, and followed by a question mark her grandmother had never resolved. I'll get to the line. You need the rest of it first. The neighbor whose fence line ran along the eastern edge of those 90 acres was a man who had been ranching in that drainage for 38 years, and who drove a truck so clean it looked like he hosed it down between the house and the county road, which was only a quarter mile, so maybe he did. He came by on a Saturday morning about 3 weeks after she'd taken possession, which was November of 2009, and he leaned on the fence the way men who have been watching ground for 38 years lean on fences, which is to say, with the full weight of their accumulated skepticism, and he looked out at the sage and the chamisa and the scattered juniper and the ravine that ran northwest to southeast and collected maybe 4 inches of rainfall a year. And he said what he said without particular cruelty, which was, "What are you going to do with 90 acres of brush and a dry arroyo?" She told him she was going to run goats. He nodded the way you nod when you have already decided someone is wrong, but you are too polite to say it plainly. He said he supposed a person could do that, and he drove back up the county road in his clean truck. And by that afternoon, someone at the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown, as these things do, from 90 acres and goats to 120 acres and a herd of exotic animals that some woman from out of state was going to try to winter on ground that wouldn't support a jackrabbit in July. She heard the version secondhand and did not correct it, because the acreage and the survival of the animals were both things that would correct themselves in time, and she had learned by then that time did the work more thoroughly than argument. The extension agent came out in December, a well-meaning young man in a clean Carhartt jacket with a clipboard and a laminated sheet from the district office that listed carrying capacity estimates for various range types in the county. He pointed to a row on the sheet that said sparse brush and degraded scrub, and showed her a number that was meant to end the conversation. The number was 1 animal unit per 40 acres for 6 months of the year. He was genuinely trying to be helpful. She thanked him and offered him coffee. And he declined because he had 2 more stops, and she watched him drive away, and then stood at the fence looking at the 90 acres for a while in the December cold, and she thought about what her grandmother had told her when she was 11 years old, standing in a different field in a different state on a late afternoon in early summer, a sentence that had stuck to the inside of her skull the way useful things do. The sentence was, "The land will tell you what it is, but you have to be quiet first." She was being quiet. She wasn't ready to run the goats yet. She put the notebook back in the cedar chest where she'd found it, because she wasn't ready for that either. The notebook had come to her the previous spring, 2009, in the settlement of her grandmother's estate, boxed with some other things from the old woman's barn. Her grandmother had homesteaded on the eastern edge of this same general region in the 1960s, had run Angora goats and a small herd of Spanish crosses on leased ground for 3 decades, into the early 1990s, had kept meticulous records in marbled notebooks, of which there were 11 total. 10 of them were straightforward ranching ledgers, animal counts, weights at shearing, pasture rotation notes, worming records, a few hand-drawn maps of fence lines and water sources. The 11th was different. It was the one with the cracked spine. It started the same as the others, careful and terse and practical, but partway through it changed, became more like a record of observations than a ledger, as if the old woman had started asking questions she didn't have columns for. There were notes on plant communities, on where certain grasses appeared after rain, on which draws and swales greened up first, and which ones greened up last, and why that might matter. There were notes on the behavior of the animals, where they chose to bed, where they refused to go, where they clustered in heat, and where they spread in cold. And then on page 47, in a passage about a specific type of terrain feature she'd encountered while looking at ground in the high desert drainage country, there was a line that had been underlined twice and followed by a question mark. The line said, "Where you find the sage this thick and this tall, inside a protected curve, look below the caliche for what the water left." She had read it in March of 2009. She had put the notebook back because she wasn't ready. She had bought the 90 acres in October of 2009 because the sage was thick and tall inside a protected curve of the arroyo's upper reach, and she could not look at it without hearing her grandmother's pencil moving. The question mark had been sitting at the end of that sentence for 40 years. She was going to answer it. She just wasn't going to do it fast. She spent the winter of 2009 into 2010 building, not rushing, building. She put up a 3-wire perimeter fence along the northern and western edges where there was no existing structure, working alone or with one neighbor's hired hand who owed her a favor, setting posts in the cold ground at 8-foot intervals, 112 posts, over the course of 6 weeks. She built a small 3-sided shelter in the lee of a rock outcropping near the center of the property. Tin roof, pole frame, no floor, banked with straw bales on 2 sides against the February wind. She ran a water line from a cistern she'd installed on the high end of the property, 600 gallons, gravity-fed to a frost-proof hydrant at the shelter. She did not rush any of this, because she had learned from the animals that rushed infrastructure fails at the worst possible moment, usually at 2 a.m. in January when the temperature is in the single digits. Her grandmother had written that in the first notebook, the one from 1971. It was not a question, it was a statement, and it did not require a question mark. In early March of 2010, she brought the first animals in. 14 Boer-Cross does, 2 bucks, all from a herd she had been managing on shares for a woman 2 counties east, animals she knew by their habits and their tolerances and their individual stubbornness, which in some cases was considerable. She brought them in on a cold Tuesday morning in a stock trailer behind her truck, pulled through the gate she'd built in November, and let them out into the sage and the chamisa and the juniper and the open flank of the arroyo. And she stood at the gate and watched what they did. What they did was immediate and purposeful. They spread. Not randomly the way confused or frightened animals spread, but in a deliberate fanning movement that took them across the first quarter-mile of terrain in less than 20 minutes, and then they settled into working, which is the only word for what browsing goats do when the brush is thick and they have not been on ground like this before. They work it like a problem. They move into it and through it, and they take what they want and leave what they don't, and they keep moving. She watched them for 2 hours that first morning. She took notes in her own notebook, which was a plain spiral-bound thing with a red cover that she'd been keeping since 2004, and she wrote down where they went first, where they lingered, where 3 or 4 of them came together in one spot and stayed for longer than browsing required. There was a place in the protected inner curve of the arroyo's upper reach, right where the sage grew tallest and most dense, where 6 of the 14 does had clustered and were working the same 20-foot radius with an intensity she hadn't seen from them on the shared ground, 2 counties east. She noted the location. She noted the date, March 9th. She did not do anything about it yet. The land was telling her something. She was being quiet. The first full season, March to November of 2010, the goats moved through approximately 40 of the 90 acres, not because she restricted them, but because the brush was thick enough to occupy them fully in that range, and because animals are efficient about their energy in a way that humans managing spreadsheets sometimes are not. By August, she could see the cleared ground well enough to walk it without pushing through brush, which she did regularly, twice a week, with a soil probe she had bought secondhand from a retired agronomist at an auction in 2007 for $32. The probe was a steel tube, 48 inches long with a T-handle, and you drove it into the ground and pulled it out, and looked at what came up in the core. What she was looking for in a general and patient way was what her grandmother had been asking about in that underlined sentence. The caliche was present, as expected, a pale hardpan layer of calcium carbonate that forms in arid soils over centuries, and that most people treat as a barrier and nothing more. But in the protected curve of the arroyo's inner bend, in the exact spot where the 6 does had clustered in March, the probe was hitting something below the caliche that did not behave like the surrounding substrate. The surrounding substrate was sandy clay, consistent and dry, which is what 47 years of carrying capacity estimates were based on. What came up in the probe core from the inner curve was darker. Not dramatically darker, not like the black loam you see in the river bottoms of the Midwest, but darker and more cohesive, holding its shape in the core rather than crumbling, and there was a faint smell to it that she could not place at first, a mineral vegetative smell that had no business being in ground that was supposed to be uniformly dry sandy clay all the way down. She pulled 3 probe cores from that 20-foot radius in August of 2010. She pulled 2 more in September. All 5 had the same anomaly below the caliche layer. She wrote the depth in her red notebook each time, and the depths were consistent, 11 to 13 inches to the caliche, and then 4 to 6 inches of caliche, and then the different material beginning at 15 to 19 inches, continuing to the full depth of the probe at 48 inches without reverting. She wrote it down. She did not tell anyone. She was not ready to tell anyone because she did not yet know what it meant. And she had learned from her grandmother's notebook and from 22 years of working ground that other people had already decided they understood completely, that you do not lead with a question. You lead with an answer. And she did not have the answer yet. In the winter of 2010 into 2011, she went back to the notebook with the cracked spine. She had been avoiding page 47, or not avoiding it exactly, more the way you avoid looking directly at something you are not sure of, the peripheral glance rather than the straight-on examination. She took the notebook out of the cedar chest on a Thursday evening in January, and sat at the kitchen table under a lamp and read it from the beginning of the changed section, page 31, through to the end, page 81. It took her 2 hours. Her grandmother had been moving through this region's drainage basins in the early 1970s, looking at ground, looking for something she described in several places only as suitable for the long work, which was her phrase for the kind of animal husbandry that requires you to think in decades rather than seasons. She had found several sites that interested her and had noted them in detail, their terrain shape, their plant communities, their soil character, their water behavior after rain. She had found at least 3 locations where the sage grew tall and dense inside a protected curve, which she noted was itself a marker of accumulated organic material at depth, because sage of that height and density in otherwise sparse range is drawing on something below what the surface soil alone could support. On page 47, she had written about one specific site where she had pushed a steel rod below the caliche layer and encountered what she described as resistant, cohesive, dark material with a smell she associated with old saturated ground, and she had written her conclusion about what that material might represent. And then she had written the underlined line, "Where you find the sage this thick and this tall inside a protected curve, look below the caliche for what the water left." And then the question mark. And then, in smaller writing underneath, added later in a slightly different pencil, "Never dug." She had never dug. She had moved on to the next site, the next drainage, the next season, and she had carried the question for 40 years, and then she had died in the spring of 2009 and put the notebook in a box in her barn and left the question for whoever came after. The question was sitting below the caliche on 90 acres of brush ground that had sold for $4,600 at a county tax sale. The next morning, she called a man she'd been referred to by the agronomist she'd bought the probe from, a man who had spent 30 years doing soil and sediment analysis for an environmental consulting firm, and had retired to the same general region and still took the occasional private inquiry if it interested him. She told him what she had. He said he'd come out the following week. He came on a Tuesday in late January of 2011, a compact man in his late 60s with a canvas field jacket and his own set of probe tools and a metal detector he carried over his shoulder without comment, and he walked the inner curve of the arroyo with her and looked at the cleared ground the goats had made and pushed his own probe into the spots she marked for him and pulled the cores and looked at them for a long time without speaking. He had a folding magnifier in his breast pocket, and he used it on the lower portion of 2 of the cores. Then he walked the perimeter of the cleared area in an expanding pattern, the way you walk when you are trying to understand the boundary of something, and then he came back to her and said he wanted to bring his own shovel the next time, and would she consent to a test pit? She said yes. He came back the following Saturday, and they dug 2 test pits, 3 feet by 3 feet, to a depth of 30 inches each, in the center of the inner curve area. What they found below the caliche was not what either of them had expected in their most specific imagining, though she had suspected something of roughly this nature from the probe cores and from her grandmother's notes, and from a paper she had found at the University Library in Albuquerque in December, a 1987 paper on buried anthropogenic soils in high desert drainage basins. A copy she had requested through interlibrary loan after the retired agronomist mentioned it in passing, which used language to describe the composition of those soils that matched what she'd been smelling on her probe cores since August of 2010. What they found at 18 inches below the surface and continuing to the full depth of the pits was a stratified deposit of dark, cohesive, organically enriched sediment that was not natural to this substrate, interleaved at irregular intervals with what appeared to be charcoal lenses, and at 22 inches in the second pit, a layer of worked stone fragments, not large, not dramatic, flat and thin and deliberately shaped, that could not have arrived in this location by any natural process. The consultant crouched at the edge of the second pit for a very long time. He used the folding magnifier on 3 of the stone fragments. Then he stood up and brushed the soil off his knee and looked at the ground around them, and then at the sage and the cleared brush, and then at the shape of the arroyo's curve, which from here, at ground level, you could see was not entirely natural, that its inner bank had a geometry to it that was slightly too consistent, slightly too deliberate, to be the work of water alone. He said one word. He said, substantial. She wrote it in her red notebook. The date was January 29th, 2011. The goats were on the far end of the property, working the brush, paying no attention to any of this, because they had already known, and they had already told her in the only language available to them, which was where they went first and where they stayed. The full picture assembled itself over the following 18 months, and I want to tell you that it assembled itself like a revelation, like a sudden dramatic uncovering, but it didn't, and I won't pretend it did, because part of what makes this story true is that nothing about it was sudden or dramatic in the usual sense. It was methodical, and it was slow, and it was the kind of exciting that only looks like excitement from the outside, because from the inside it feels mostly like careful work and long waiting, and a lot of mornings looking at the same patch of ground and asking the same question in slightly different ways. The consultant brought in a colleague, a woman who had done her doctoral work on pre-colonial land use in the Southwest, and who had been teaching at a state university for 21 years, and who drove a very old station wagon and wore her gray hair in a braid and looked at the test pits with the same long, still quality that the consultant had, and then walked the full extent of the cleared area, which by the spring of 2011 the goats had extended to about 60 of the 90 acres, and she took her own samples and her own notes, and she came back 3 weeks later with a preliminary assessment. The cleared ground, the ground the goats had been working for 14 months, contained evidence of continuous human occupation and land modification spanning what the radiocarbon dating of charcoal samples from the deeper strata eventually confirmed was approximately 700 years, from the early 14th century to the early 17th century, with the most intensive activity concentrated in the inner curve of the arroyo, where the sage had been tallest and the probe cores had smelled of old saturated ground. The worked stone fragments in the second test pit were construction material, not monumental, not the massive dressed stone of the larger regional traditions, but practical, careful, hand-shaped, consistent with the building practices of small agricultural communities in this region in the centuries before Spanish contact. Below the construction layer, at depths between 28 and 36 inches, they found evidence of intentional soil amendment. The charcoal lenses and the dark cohesive material her grandmother had described as what the water left, which was not precisely accurate, but was not entirely wrong either, which is how old inherited knowledge usually works. It bends around the truth rather than stating it exactly, and the bending is a kind of accuracy too. What the material actually was a buried anthropogenic soil complex, a terra preta analog, dark earth built deliberately over generations by people who had understood something about this particular curve in this particular drainage, who had known that the protected geometry of the inner bank created a microclimate, a slight but consistent difference in temperature and moisture retention, and had worked that knowledge into the ground with organic material and char over centuries until the soil at depth was categorically different from the surrounding substrate. The sage was tall here because the people had made it possible for something to grow tall here. The goats had found it because tall sage is better browse, and they had worked that area first and hardest because the underlying soil even through the caliche was producing plant growth of a different quality than the surrounding range. The animals had not known about the archaeology, they had known about the food. The food was pointing at the same thing the archaeology was pointing at, which was a place where human patience and attention had been accumulating in the ground for 7 centuries, waiting for someone to be quiet enough to notice. The university applied for the relevant permits by the end of 2011. The formal excavation began in the summer of 2012 and ran for portions of 3 seasons. What emerged, carefully and in the right sequence, was the partial structural remains of what the archaeological team's published report in 2015 would describe as a small mission-period visita, a satellite site of a larger mission complex in the region, built on and around an earlier indigenous agricultural and habitation site. The earlier site being substantially older than the mission construction and of considerable regional significance. The stone construction was not the grand architecture of the main mission complexes to the south and west. It was modest and practical. Thick walls of the same flat-work stone she had found at 22 inches. A single rectangular structure of approximately 40 feet by 20 feet, with evidence of a secondary attachment on the eastern end, built directly over and incorporating elements of the earlier indigenous structures, as was common practice in this period. The report noted that the site's preservation was exceptional, specifically because the caliche layer had acted as an effective seal over the lower strata, and because the surface had never been cultivated mechanically, which was itself a function of the sage cover being too dense for any practical agricultural use in the modern era, which was itself a function of the anthropogenic soil complex below driving plant growth robust enough to produce that density of cover in ground that otherwise supported only sparse vegetation. The sage had protected what was underneath it. The goats had cleared the sage. The woman had followed the goats. Her grandmother had asked the question roughly 35 years before and never dug. She dug. The extension agent's carrying capacity number was never exactly wrong for the range type he had assessed, which was the 90 acres taken as an undifferentiated block of sparse brush and degraded scrub. It was wrong for what was actually there, which was a specific zone of elevated soil productivity inside a protected arroyo curve underlain by 700 years of deliberate human soil amendment, sealed by caliche, and announced by the height and density of the sage that grew above it. The number on his laminated sheet was not designed to account for what had been built into this particular ground over roughly 25 generations. He hadn't known to look for it. She had. Because her grandmother had asked a question in pencil in a marbled notebook in 1973 and had underlined it twice, and had never answered it, and had died with it open, and had left it open for whoever came after who was quiet enough to hear it. The neighbor in the clean truck came by in the spring of 2013 after the first full season of excavation, when the university's equipment had been on the property and the news had made a brief appearance in the regional paper, and the county extension office had sent a different agent out, one who was considerably less certain about his laminated sheets. The neighbor leaned on the fence the way he had in November of 2009, with the same weight and the same economy of gesture, and he looked at the cleared ground and the staked excavation areas and the students working in the careful, slow manner that archaeology requires. And he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not as brushed up as it was." She said, "No, it wasn't." He nodded. He said he supposed those goats had done some work. She said they had. He said, "Find anything interesting down there?" She said they'd found a few things. He nodded again. He said, "Well." He drove on. That was the concession, and it was enough, and she did not need it to be more than it was. She had not bought those 90 acres to be right at the neighbor. She had bought them to answer a question that had been waiting in a cracked spine notebook for 40 years, and the question was answered now, and it was answered in the ground, in the dark cohesive material below the caliche, in the flat work stone at 22 inches, in the charcoal lenses, and the stratified record of 3 centuries of patient human presence. And it was answered in the behavior of 14 boar-cross does on a cold Tuesday morning in March of 2010, when they fanned out into the sage and went first and fastest to the place where the ground was best, because the ground was best there, because people before any of them had made it that way, carefully and over a very long time, and the making had outlasted the makers by roughly 400 years, and was still doing its work in the soil when the animals walked over it and recognized it for what it was. The old woman's sentence comes back to me every time I think about this. The land will tell you what it is, but you have to be quiet first. Her grandmother had written the question. She had been quiet enough to hear the answer. That is the whole of it. That is every bit of it. There is a version of this story where the 90 acres got bid up at the tax sale, and a developer bought it and pushed dozers through the sage and buried the caliche under 6 inches of aggregate base and put up a 40-unit storage facility and never knew what was 18 inches below the floor of the second-to-last unit on the east side. That version happened in 50 other drainages in this region during the same decade. The reason it didn't happen here is one woman with a gut feeling and a marbled notebook and 14 goats who knew which direction to walk first, and a grandmother who underlined a sentence twice and then wrote, "Never dug underneath it," and left the question open for whoever came after with the patience to close it. If you have your own piece of ground that other people have already decided they understand completely, or your own inherited notebook with a question that hasn't been answered yet, or your own animals telling you something in the only language they have, I would very much like to hear about it in the comments below. The slow work is the real work. It always has been. Subscribe if this meant something to you, and I will see you on the next one.